The outcome of these chronic inflammations, including, when you go gluten-free, you still have an inflammation in the gut because we are not taking care of our microbiome as we used to. And when microbiome suffers, we suffer.
So many people have this weird relationship with gluten where they cut it out completely, only in Europe. And I wanted to untangle the misunderstandings and what disconnect is, and we'll dive into where the science stands.
But if I have to point to one responsibility in terms of the most impactful elements that is creating this stress of the microbiome.
Microbiome, in my observation, is similar to either deep sea studies or space travel. We know there's something there, but we are just scratching the surface.
And we didn't realize that there's this very sophisticated, ancient, savvy civilization that we live entrenched in, because we can't see it. Why you produce too much zonulin, making that's the leak, and therefore being part of that 5 pillars? And the answer is the most powerful situation that increases the production of zonulin is dysbiosis, a microbiome that goes off balance. What is the second most powerful?
Welcome back to the 90% Healthy podcast. Today we have a very exciting guest who I'm going to introduce in just a minute, but I just want to kick this off with reminding all of you that Don and I often talk about how our environment is acting against us in many ways. We're looking at the wrong light at the wrong time. We're eating the wrong food at the wrong time. We're not moving hardly as much as we should. And as much as we've talked about how it impacts our energy, we're going to drill a lot deeper today into how it's impacting our gut health, our microbiome, and then from deep down there, bring it back up into the service and how it shows up and manifests in our health long term. So today we have Dr. Alessio Fasano joining us. Hello, Dr. Fasano.
Thank you, Claudia, for having me.
I wanted to give a brief intro in terms of where you are right now. So please correct me if I'm wrong, but you've spent over 30 years literally at the forefront of research on celiac disease, gluten sensitivity, and the gut microbiome is large. I mean, you've written books like The Gluten Freedom, many of our listeners may be familiar with it, as well as Gut Feelings. And you have often challenged the medical community to really rethink the origins of chronic disease. And I believe right now you've been a gastroenterologist, director of the Center for Celiac Research and Treatment at Massachusetts General Hospital.
Yes.
Is there anything exciting that I haven't mentioned, but you're currently highly involved with?
Well, again, I'm pretty sure we will have a chance to discuss, but, yes, we are at the crossroads of transformational science when it comes to nutrition. So there is so much of what's going on that we can eventually cover, during, our chat today.
And some of the things we'll talk about is really close to home, both to Don and I. It's gluten and how gluten doesn't fit into our life. So many people have this weird relationship with gluten where they cut it out completely, only in Europe, only European wheat. So there are so many different ways that we have relationships with gluten. And I wanted to untangle the misunderstandings and what disconnect is, and we'll dive into where the science stands now. And Don, I know you have quite a bit of history with gluten, so I wanted to patch that over to you and kick it off.
Sure. Dr. Fasano, celiac disease hits very close to our family. Probably 20 years ago, my wife was struggling. There was some stuff going on with her diet. There were some gastrointestinal things going on. And then we had an event where she had a really bad day. And when she has a bad day with gluten, I'm usually holding her hair back and just trying to get her through it. And so back then I was teaching at a small school in Western Ohio, and I started to dig in, and I came across Dr. William Davis's book, Wheat Belly, which gave me a little bit of an indication of what's going on. And I also came across Good Calories, Bad Calories by Gary Taubes. And this is where we are introduced to the concept that the wheat we have today is different than the wheat we had 30 and 40 years ago. and maybe it's a little longer than that, 40, 50 years ago, that we genetically modified our wheat, particularly in this country, for mass harvest. And we wound up with different genetics, where the genetics had different gluten amounts. And this is the byproduct of big ag. Did this happen worldwide, or is this a United States centric modification that's driven a lot of these changes in your mind?
Well, this is a controversial topic because there are different opinions on the matter. So, if we want to be factual, there have been, three major changes in the genetics of wheat. One happened, roughly 2,000 years ago when Romans and Greeks, they used wheat for as a staple, that was heavily used, of course, even their time to make bread or make beer. And this was a rather rudimental, plant, was very tall. Only the top of the plant has, the grains that you can use. And, the amount of gluten was roughly 4 grams per 100 grams of dry weight. That was roughly what was at that time. The second major genetic change happened, during Renaissance, in which there was breeding, and this all done by farmers, of course. And the goal was to increase the yield. There was the breeding that brought doubling the amount of chromosome of the plant and doubling the amount of gluten. So for 4 to 8 grams. The plant became shorter. And then the final one happened roughly 200 years ago with the agricultural revolution. The cultivars that are the ones that we have right now are very short. 1/3 is the plant, and now you have 12 grams of gluten per 100 grams of dry weight. So 3 times more than the Romans and the Greeks they used to have by the same unit of weight. There's been no changes ever since genetically of the plants. These are factual. Nonetheless, grains in the United States seems to be more quote unquote offensive than grains in Europe. We hear it from our patients all the time. When I go to Europe, it looks like that I can handle this better than when I'm in the United States. And, again, if I indulge to eat too much of, gluten containing stuff, no matter what I do it, I'm in trouble. And again, the question is, how do you explain all this? So now this is not science, but now start to think about, common sense. For example, if you go to Europe and you look from the process of panification, so in other words, to make bread, okay, they still use the old way to do it. So that you take the flour, you take the water, you take the yeast, and it's an overnight process. Now, the major reason why people that have problem with gluten, celiac disease or other form of gluten reactions, is because there are elements in gluten that we cannot digest completely. So, in other words, gluten is a mixture of proteins, a sort of pearl necklace, if you wish, that needs to be broken. And we do this through our digestive enzyme, first in little pieces, and then we peel this pearl one at a time. They're called amino acids. Well, we can't do that completely because we don't have the enzymes to peel all these amino acids off. So we have these fragments that stay undigested. And those are the ones that induce problems if you're genetically predisposed to do so, like your wife. We don't have these enzymes. Yeast, they do. So they can digest these fragments. So if you leave yeast to work for 16, 14 hours, so in other words, overnight, most of the load of the offending material is broken.
Interesting.
Here in the United States, that process is 2 hours because we don't accelerate. So we prepare an accelerated way of panification. And if you give only 2 hours, for, the panification, you start from the same material, the same 12 grams of gluten, but now here you have many more of these fragments that can give you trouble because you give only 2 hours to the yeast to digest them compared to what's happened in Europe. Another possibility is not the grain by itself, but what's on the grain. Calls to, because these are multinational companies that they need to save their harvests, and they use chemicals they are not allowed Europe, for example. And that's chemicals on the grain actually is the offending material, not the grain by itself. So no,
Interesting.
that's another. Yeah, a couple of possibilities, in other words, that seems to suggest why we have these differences.
So for our audience and everybody, I want to recommend, gluten freedom was, I heard you on another podcast, and Dr. Fasano, my wife and I live in an RV and we travel all over the country. So we have extended drive periods. So we need things to listen to when we drive. But yours was not a have to listen. Yours was a want to. We tore this book apart because it was very informative. And the thing that was news to us, that was looking at that, the I think you call it the gluten related disorders algorithm, however you call it, that there is an autoimmune response in some people, there is an allergic response in other people, and there is a non-autoimmune, non-allergic of gluten sensitivity or wheat sensitivity. Can you dig in just a little bit and give us kind of a 30,000-foot view of those three levels?
Yeah, sure. And matter of fact, it's an important point that you made, because you start with the discussion about this gluten, how offensive it can be to different people, and so on and so forth. Until the recent past, and maybe even now, among healthcare professionals, scientists, and so on and so forth, and the public in general, there are two schools of thoughts. The very conservative, the ones that say the only proved the condition that is driven by gluten ingestion is celiac disease. Only people with celiac disease that belong to go on a gluten-free diet. The other end of the spectrum, there are the people that say gluten is offensive for everybody, and if we all do not embrace a gluten-free diet, humankind will be extinct in a couple of generations. Of course, the truth is something in the middle, because when I say we, I'm saying about, we as healthcare professionals learn the hard way the lesson that is much more than celiac disease. How we did that? Because we were with the old paradigms, with the old school that say, if you don't have celiac disease, you have no business to be on a gluten-free diet. Patients listen, and they came back and said, I hear you. I tried everything else to explain my symptoms. I cannot find any other explanation. The only thing that relieves my symptoms is going gluten free. Call me whatever you want, even if I'm not celiac. I'm going to go gluten free. And that person become 10, and then became 100 and 1,000. And now you have to succumb to what is the reality of the story. And that's how we move from the concept of single condition, i.e., celiac disease, to a spectrum of gluten-related disorders. Some of the elements are common to the the three conditions that you mentioned on. So you got to have the same thing. You need to be genetically predisposed for any kind of disease, including these three conditions. Two, of course, you have to eat something that has gluten in it. All right. Three, as we said, we cannot digest completely this fragment. Four, something has to be wrong in your gut barrier that becomes leak. So allow this undigested fragment to come from the external world, i.e. the gut lumen, into your body. All these elements are common to these three conditions. Now you have the divergence, because now depends who genetically, what kind of genetic you have. So if you're genetically predisposed for celiac disease, so autoimmune disease, that fragment that comes through is managed in a certain way that now you have specific immune cells that handle this gluten in a way that leads to kill your own body, in this case, the intestine that got damaged, and you have the clinical consequence of that damage. That's the premise of celiac disease. 1% of the general population will have that problem. The same fragment that came through the same first four steps that come through, if happen to be in the body of somebody that's genetically predisposed of a food allergy like wheat allergy, would be handled by another set of immune cells that will lead to a different immune response that would not kill your tissue, because it's not an autoimmune disease, but create an inflammatory condition that leads to a clinical outcome that can be, again, different signs and symptoms. Third, same steps, but you don't have an autoimmune disease. You're not genetically predisposed of a food allergy like wheat allergy, but you are predisposed genetically to handle this fragment in a way that induce the immune system to fight. And when you fight, you create inflammation, then you develop, this other form of gluten sensitivity or non-celiac gluten sensitivity. Of course, question is, how do you distinguish among these forms? And, what are the clinical implications to deciding which part of the spectrum you are as a patient? First of all, again, the key elements to appreciate is the clinic is not helpful. In other words, what I'm saying is the way that your wife reacts to, exposure to gluten would not help me to say in which part of the spectrum she is, because the symptoms can be very overlapping among the three conditions. For celiac disease, we have specific biomarkers, specific autoantibodies. The same we have sometimes, not always, for wheat allergy, because it can be mediated by some immunoglobulins we call IgE. And therefore, if you're positive for the IgE for wheat, that's where you make the diagnosis. Gluten sensitivity, unfortunately, we don't have biomarkers that are validated yet. So we tend to exclude celiac disease, we tend to exclude wheat allergy. And if both are excluded, then you go in the premise of non-celiac gluten sensitivity. Why is it important to make the difference? Because with wheat allergy, you may grow out of it, like any other food allergy. And in general, there is no comorbidities. In other words, that you develop, associated conditions. However, like any other allergy, can be severe. You can go all the way to anaphylaxis. So this needs to be, very clearly spelled out. Gluten sensitivity, again, you don't have comorbidities as well, but we don't know if you will stick with this for life or like for wheat allergy, you may eventually grow out of it. Finally, with celiac disease, of course, it's for life because it's an autoimmune disease. You're not going to grow out of it. Because it's an autoimmune disease, you have an increased risk of comorbidity with other autoimmune diseases, particularly the ones that target the thyroid that we call Hashimoto thyroiditis or type 1 diabetes. They're very frequently associated. And again, the stringency to the gluten-free diet has to be 100% for life. Conversely, for the other two, it depends how severe is your form. Some people with gluten sensitivity, for example, can have a bite of pizza, 2 bites, they got sick. Celiac, it can't be that way.
So the same way we may grow out of the allergy, we can also grow into the allergy. This can be something that comes on. You maybe you could have eaten anything as a kid, but as an adult, you start to develop challenges and you grow into that allergy. Is that correct?
That's accurate and correct. It was not the case until the recent past. So in general, the march from genetic predisposition to a clinical outcome in allergy was, okay, I'm born with the genetic predisposition, and then, eventually I developed this food allergy, and then I'll grow out of it. And that was premise of pediatrics in general. Now we see people that develop food allergies in their 20s or 30s, and people that start to scratch their heads. That how does that happen? And matter of fact, this happens mostly, almost exclusively, people that embrace a Western lifestyle. And the answer is environment counts, lifestyle counts. Contrary to what we believed before, being born with a genetic predisposition of food allergy or autoimmunity or cancer or Alzheimer or Parkinson is not a destiny. We thought that was the case. It all depends how we play our genetic cards and therefore our, lifestyle. And the major challenge that we're facing right now is to understand what we've been doing wrong, embracing a Western lifestyle that led us this surge of all these chronic inflammatory diseases, including food allergies, that we may eventually look at so that we can slow down or mitigate this trend.
What a great segue, Claudia. Let's dig into environment
It
a
is
little
a
bit.
perfect segue. Because I wanted to talk about something I've heard you discuss, which is that you found to be 5 key contributing factors to turn a predisposition into a clinical outcome. Would you describe what these 5 are and maybe dive a little bit more into how even individuals who are gluten-free still have a high percentage of gut inflammation? So maybe dive a little bit into that and how our current model of living leads into the rise of dysbiosis and gut
Yeah.
permeability, even without gluten.
I mean, until the recent past, the paradigm of any disease of humankind was based on two pillars. And genetics, who are you genetically speaking, and your lifestyle, so your environment. Two issues that we discussed talking about the gluten-related disorders. And then, what we, realized that, again, take a look at some epidemiological trends, that those two pillars will be probably necessary, but not sufficient to explain what's going on. Let me explain a little bit more what I mean. For almost 2 million years of our evolution, the main reason why we got sick and died was only one: infections. That was it. With a life expectancy of 14 years, they didn't have time to develop a metabolic disorder, whatever. And infection was the main reason why we died, until we start to understand the basic of infections. So science like, infectious diseases start to bloom, and we start to understand, there are bugs that were killing us, or making us sick, and so on and so forth. And that led the implementation of new measures: sanification of waters, antibiotics, vaccines, and so on and so forth. And when we implemented this kind of remedy, and was mainly, again, in the Western Hemisphere, what we saw was a dramatic drop of conditions like hepatitis A, tuberculosis, measles, rogeola, you name it, okay? However, and we didn't plan, or we didn't anticipate that, we saw this surge of non-infected chronic inflammatory diseases like allergies, like autoimmunity, metabolic disorders, neurodevelopmental disorders like autism, or neurodegenerative disorders, cancer, and so on and so forth. In other words, if you embrace a Western lifestyle, you don't die fast of infection, you die slowly of chronic inflammatory diseases. And again, with the premise that we have only two pillars, genes and environment, the only explanation to explain this surge is not that you can blame genetic mutation. That takes generation, and all this happened in 20, 30 years. That was it. So we thought, okay, we are changing the environment too fast for us to adapt. But again, as I was mentioned before, you want to see the same epidemiological data in a more positive way. You can say, you know what? If I'm born with the genes for breast cancer, it's not my destiny, as we believe. I can't do anything. It depends how I play my genetic cards. And that led us also to understand that these two players are fundamentally important. But there are other three players, as you are mentioned, Claudia, these five pillars. There are the perfect storm that needs to come together to develop any disease of humankind. The third being, these two worlds are my genes that live in my body, and this offending material that is from the environment need to interact physically. Something that normally doesn't happen because we have barriers. The ones that we see all the time is the skin, of course, because it's visible. The most studied, the most complex, and definitely the most impactful is the intestine. So an intestinal leaks seems to be, a third element that is necessary. We talk about chronic inflammatory diseases, or the fourth element has to be the immune system that it become hyperbelligerent, doing inflammation even when it's not needed. And the fifth, and for whatever we understand, the most impactful is this ecosystem, very complex, that we call the microbiome, with which we co-evolve and we stand, the entire evolution of our life from birth to death. That is fundamentally important. Why? Because it is our understanding now that it's the microbiome that crosstalk with us and decide if, when, why, and how our genes plural will be turned on and off, and that will start that march from genetic predisposition to clinical outcome. In other words, a concept that we call technically epigenetics. They are capable to do that, and they do this all the time. So most likely, the outcome of these chronic inflammations, including, when you go to the free, you still have an inflammation in the gut and so on and so forth, is because we are not taking care of our microbiome as we used to. And when the microbiome suffers, we suffer because now we touch the wrong chords and we start that march from genetic predisposition to clinical outcome.
That's really interesting.
Thank you so much for
Yeah,
explaining.
that's really cool. So, Dr. Fasano, when we start talking about microbiome, as I've looked at this, microbiome, in my observation, is similar to either deep sea studies or space travel. We know there's something there, but we are just scratching the surface. We don't have. Is that an accurate observation? Because as I look at many of the microbiome products and things that's out there, I'm thinking, great, but really you're putting a toe in the water at the seashore. You're not going 10,000 deep down in the Marianas Trench, because life is different down there. Is that accurate when it comes to understanding the microbiome at this point?
Very accurate. Matter of fact, the opening of Gut Feeling, that's the book on microbiome that we wrote, it comes right in that sense that, we have been, humankind has been always, aiming at finding a new world to explore new realities because we believe that we're not alone. And, of course, to look at the deep sea to see if there are creatures they haven't seen before. And most importantly, we look at the space as a place where we find something that is similar to us as a another civilizations. And we didn't realize that there's this very sophisticated, ancient, savvy civilization that we live entrenched in because we can't see it. We start to really scratch the surface. But, once you start to really get inside, you see how sophisticated they are, how altruistic they are, how the microbes are really built for the good of the community. I wish that we as a species will have that kind of attitude. We will not deal with all this, insanity that we're living nowadays. And I don't want to be politically correct. We're not going to touch on that. But all this to say is they were here before us. They definitely would be here after we will be extinct as a species. And there is a reason why. Because again, they operate in a way that is good for the community. And, the essence of what they do is the survival of the species. That's what it is.
We're going to walk away from this saying it's about the good of the community, Claudia. That's the lesson today.
Yeah.
So,
And by
Yes,
the way,
but
there's another message that I really want to, pass along. We believe to be, as a species, a human species, the center of the attention of the universe. We're not. For the microbes, we're a part of a circle of life. They come to us, they leave us, they go on the soil, and then they want to go to the water, and then the water they go to the air, and they come back. And why they are so resilient? Because they adapt very fast. If you go to the deep sea that you were mentioning down 10,000 feet down, very cold and dark, there are microbes there. You go on the volcanoes at thousands of degrees, you're going to find bugs in there. Why? They reproduce every 20 minutes and they adapt. So we are not capable to that adaptation, and we are responsible for our own destiny. If we pollute, of course, we're gonna get the polluted microbes that come in my microbiome, and that will make me sick. That's the reality of the story. For them, we are part of a circle of life. The pathogens, the one that kill us. In other words, they are the wrong folks. They are. It's the minuscule percentage of the microbiome. Pathogens are not smart enough because if those that die, they lose their biological niche. The ones that they establish a friendly relationship with us are the ones that are visionary. Let's say, good for me. I found a biological niche. These fellows give me hospitality food. In exchange, I will give something to them because they do big time give us good
absolutely.
things if we care for them.
Oh, give me
I
just a second.
go for it.
So
Yeah.
your establishment as zonulin as a key element in gut health. That's a huge step, but it's very early. Are you willing to look into the future? Do you think we'll have a real handle on the gut microbiome in a decade? Is it going to take us 2 decades? Is it going to take us a century? Where do you see this coming in the future?
So I can't put the timeline down on this, but science is acceleration to a huge pace. So if you asked me 2 years ago what is going on right now, I would have told you, you must be out of your mind. That's not possible. And it's happening. So, You mentioned zonulin. That's another story of serendipity. That is the molecule that we discovered now almost 2 decades ago that is responsible for one of the 5 pillars, either increased gut permeability or the leaky gut, whatever you want to call it. This has been an object now almost 1,000 papers that, link zonulin to a variety of conditions, from infections to aging to neurodevelopment disorder to cancer to metabolic disorder, autoimmune, food allergy, and so on and so forth. Why? Because again, it's one of the 5 pillars of any disease. So that's the long and the short. And when you ask yourself why you produce too much zonulin making the intestinal leak and therefore being part of that 5 pillars, and the answer is the most powerful situation that increases the production of zonulin is dysbiosis, a microbiome that goes off balance. What is the second most powerful? Gluten. Gluten, one of these 2 actually of these undigested fragments that we cannot digest for gluten, they communicate with our cells to induce release of zonulin.
Interesting. Claudia?
So going beyond zonulin, I wanted to touch on dysbiosis. As we mentioned, we're not really good at taking care of that community within us. Most of us have a very poor diversity of microbes. And just both the composition and function of our microbiome has changed tremendously. A lot of people, when we think about microbiome and destroying it, they think of antibiotics, which is, of course, one thing. But I would like to ask you to explain what are some of the other ways that we are not taking care of our microbiome from a lifestyle dietary standpoint and creating this extremely weak diversity?
So the plan of evolution that led us to find that sweet spot of relationship, friendly relation with microbiome was to be born by vaginal delivery, to eat good foods, to have little infection. 2 million years ago, we were a few, and this change from one to another was rare because, we were sparse. Of course, there were no antibiotics. So that was the plan. That's been revolutionized by, the Western lifestyle. We're born by C-section even when it's not necessary. I mean, of course, you're welcome to save mom and or the baby, but not to organize the obstetrician vacations, for example. We feed junk to our kids. We take abuse of antibiotics, a lot of infections. Line. Now we put a lot of stress on the microbiome, and the composition and function is changing for worse, and that's what is going on. But if I have to point to one responsibility in terms of the most impactful elements that is creating this stress of the microbiome, you're born once, you take antibiotics 2, 3, 5 times a year, you eat 3, 4 times a day. So by far, nutrition is the most impactful elements that probably led us to wherever we are right now. If you allow me a parallel, the microbiome is a sort of farm with many animals. You have chicken, you have horses, you have, pigs, and so on and so forth. They eat different stuff. And, if now you starve one of these animals, species, let's say the chicken, you're not going to make eggs anymore in your farm. Now, out of metaphor, as you said, a healthy microbiome is a diversified microbiome. But if you lose that diversification, now you have, rather than 800, 900 species, you have, 600, 400, because you starve the others. Those folks, they take over, particularly the bad guys, may eventually take over, and now you have an imbalanced composition and therefore a functional microbiome. Now you start to do that touching with genetic accords in the wrong way and so on and so forth. What is the corollary of what I said? Because all my patients, they ask that, okay, if that's the case, what I need to eat? What is the diet that will eventually keep me feeding a healthy microbiome, taking care of gut health and so on and so forth? And the answer is not easy because, the obvious answer is, okay, how do we evolve? How do we get here? For 2 million years, what we've been eating, because, that's the way that we develop our relationship with the microbiome. A lot of fruits, a lot of vegetables, a lot of nuts, tubers, olive oil. Why? Gathering this stuff, they don't run, they're there. Meat, of course, but you're going to have to be a good hunter and lean meat. So the proportions, a lot of fruits and vegetables and nuts and tubers, very little meat because, We need to be omnivore. We need to eat also meat, of course, but what's rare because, you got to cut that. Meaning that, going back to the metaphor, if I have 100 chicken and I have 2 horses, I need to have a little bit less to feed the horses and much more to eat the chicken. Now we are the other way around, and we wonder how come that we're in trouble. It's the obvious, the last thing to say, nutrition is very impactful. It's equal impactful. You can eat as good as you want. The diet that I described is what we call it Mediterranean diet. If you have a Mediterranean diet and you sit on the couch 12 hours a day, that's not going to work. You got to go on the Mediterranean lifestyle. That means eat well, be on the move, very low stress because these people don't stress that much. Good sleeping hygiene. So in other words, it's an entire living a community life and not isolated because we're social animals. All these are fundamentally important to take good care of our microbiome.
So a quick question. I grew up on a big farm in Ohio, big beef cattle operation. And Dr. Fasano, we would go back walking through our fields. And if my brother was walking in front of me and I tripped across an old cow pie that was a little dried off, we tried to hit each other in the head with those. I'm convinced I modified my microbiome and I might have picked up a couple IQ points from the bacteria that probably got in my mouth when that happened. Is that too big a stretch? Okay.
That's a fact. It's not a stretch. It's scientifically proved that, people that live with pets or live on the farm, they are less subjected to a variety of chronic inflammatory diseases because there's that exchange, their enrichment. I didn't live on a farm, but I live in a very humble family in which my grandfather had a farm. So we visit the farm, all the time, and we played the same game that you did.
And the food, one of the big things that's changed too is that, oh, listen, this is over 50 years now, is the food in our refrigerator was not necessarily fresh. You would grab something to eat and it'd have a little bit of a tang to it, but it was that fermentation also brought a value with it too to the microbiome.
Yeah, yeah. Of course, you increase the diversity because you bring yeast in there and that kind of stuff. And you also got the resiliency because if you have a different, it's the check and balance. That's what the microbiome is. So it's the bad guy, a pathogen got there. The good guys will take care of it. After all, penicillin is nothing else than a molecule produced by a bug to kill another bug. So they want peace on the ground. They don't want the bossy people to take over. But if you take antibiotics, for example, you junk, it's like they will put a bombshell on the city and a bunch of people will be gone.
Interesting.
I have a quick question in terms of that. What all of that leads to is that intestinal permeability. Do you think all of us at some point in our life will experience intestinal permeability? And then what does it depend upon how well our body repairs it? Would one of us repair it better, faster than the other one?
So, a little bit of biology 101, but not going too much into technical details. The intestine is a very long tube. I talk about the intestine, but this can apply to general urinary tract, the blood-brain barrier, or, the airways story. These are barriers that divide, different body compartments between us and the external world. This barrier by a single layer of cells, okay, that cover the entire, for example, GI tract from the mouth all the way to the anus. They were in the past conceptualized as sealed between each other. So anything that from the environment coming in our body has to go through the cell, not in between. Only recently, relatively speaking, so late 70s, early 80s, a Japanese group say, well, no, there is no cement from a cell to another. They are gates. Most of the time they're closed, but because the gates, they can be open to let stuff come in for a very short period of time and then get closed. And that's important for us to learn about our environment, to train our immune system to go after, the bad guys, that kind of stuff. Now, the problem arises when these gates, rather to do this, will stay open way too long. And now they have a flux of bad guys coming in. Now, what's going to be the consequence of that depends who you are. Meaning, if you are genetically, programmed your immune system in the correct way, that flux of bad guys can be taken care of. Clean it out. You don't even know that happened, and you stay healthy. And that's the end of the story. On the other spectrum, on the other end of the spectrum, as Don was saying, you may be somebody that, again, are in your 30s. Now you have the conditions that, again, dysbiosis, you took an antibiotics, you got an infection, you took a trip somewhere, and now you have a different ecosystem. Now you produce too much zonulin, and again, this will make you have dysbiosis that will make you to produce too much zonulin. Now you have these gates open for too long. That didn't happen for you for the previous 20 years. Now it's happening. Stuff that is undigested, for example, I don't know, shellfish, proteins or whatever, comes through, and now I develop, an allergy. That's the way that goes.
Very
Very good.
interesting. Because I personally notice a difference, and I'm probably not alone, where especially if someone who has moved to the States from Europe notices that it doesn't necessarily have to be about gluten, but in general about eating at a place where you grew up, where your microbiome may have originated from, your
Yeah.
body tends to appreciate that better and adapt better, even if it's gluten or some type of a non-healthy food or something that you may have a lot more of a bloating type of reaction in the US. I notice whatever I eat in Europe, it's always become one of those things where my body reacts a lot
I
better.
also moved from Europe when I was a young adult, and my culture shock was twofold. The time that people have dinner here, I'm used to have dinner 8:30, 9 o'clock at night. I forget that it's the right thing to do, but that's was my style compared to 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock in the afternoon. That for me, it's inconceivable. And the kind of foods that was really a culture shock, to the point in which immediately I said, oh, this is not going to be parts of my lifestyle because, you're spoiled when you eat a certain way. And again, I come from a very humble family and from the South, from where the Mediterranean diet, Hansel Keys, find out about the Mediterranean diet. But, trust me, these people, they don't eat that way, even nowadays, for their choice. It's mandatory. My source of protein were legumes. I remember that the day of the week was established what the kind of legumes will be in the pasta. Mondays, pasta and lentils. Tuesdays, pasta and the beans, and so on and so forth. That's the way that I remember the day of the week. Sunday, if you're lucky, that's the day for meat.
Mhm.
That was
Interesting.
it.
Yeah.
Coming over here, it's just totally different. It's, as you said, it's not just the gluten, but the way that, eventually the proportion, sides that are much bigger than I'm used to. Or, the condiments that, add stuff, sodas that bring the sugars on top of what you drink. Why typically you drink water and maybe on a glass of wine a night that you make for yourself, by the way. That's pretty much what it is.
Yeah.
So all this adds up to, come up with a situation in which, you took 2 million years to build this unbelievable car, this Ferrari that performed wonderfully, that was meant to have in the tank super octane gas, and now you put water in there and wonder how come it's not performing.
Interesting. So that Mediterranean lifestyle,
I agree.
Uzo and Sambuca, do those contribute to my gut, or am I just kidding myself?
No, actually, I believe that, a little bit of alcohol in good proportion is part of the syndicate. So it's absolutely fine. Some who have better than
Does
others.
your
No, I'm
does your
kidding. They
colleague
are
David
good.
Sinclair agree with that, or are you guys on different sides of the page on that one?
No, well, again, I respect everybody, including his opinion, and of course, again, to be honest, and without making any kind of strong statement, I believe that quality of life is the fundamental goal that we have to have. It makes no sense that you aim to live until 100, of which 40 years on a wheelchair with the tip of your nose and pull-ups because you're incontinent. It's not the way that you need to aim for. The aim is to live long and active life so that you enjoy yourself. The society can, eventually have you as an asset and a liability. And again, if part of your lifestyle that makes you to go through the day with happiness, with a willingness to wake up in the morning happy, it's a glass of wine. I don't see the problem. This stream to say, and we made these mistakes, meaning we nutritionists, I'm talking about myself, we made this mistake in the past. Example, we demonize fat to say absolutely everything has to be fat free, the skim milk and whatever, to then learn, oh my gosh, that's not the case. Fat has to be, lipids or fat, whatever, has to be part of the diet. It's the proportion that's the problem. You know, the same goes with alcohol. Of course, if you drink, super alcoholic, 7 days a week or a bottle of wine every day, that's definitely not, that's detrimental. But, I can make the argument that a good glass of red wine has so much polyphenols in there that it's an asset, it's not a liability.
Yeah, no, I've often said, but the benefit of that alcohol comes in the first few sips and is rarely found at the bottom of the bottle.
Yeah. And the other thing is, talking about lifestyle, it's also how do you do that? Because if you drink, wine, socially with no food, that's one thing. If you have a meal with wine,
absolutely,
it's a total
love
different
that.
way. Because of course, there is different biological
So as we get ready to close up here a little bit, I mean, from a scientific standpoint, you have truly traveled the road less traveled, meaning that you presented your work on zonulin and some of this intestinal permeability, and your peers, you got some pretty good pushback. What was that like?
It was an interesting journey. Again, I personally, let me, for the benefit of the listeners, science is an interesting journey. First of all, science is a constellation of failures with very few successes, first and foremost. There are two kinds of science, and you don't choose among the two, by the way. There is the incremental science. You're at point A, you want to go to point B, you design a journey that is an experiment or a trial, and, eventually, most of the time, you go from point A to point B. Your peers understand where you're coming from, and they understand where you want to go. And this is the science that more easily accepted. Then there is a transformational science. You start from point A, your intention to go to point B. Now you find yourself at point Z. Most of the time, it's a dead end, it's the failure, it's the end of the story. Sometimes, though, you open a new paradigm of science. And the transformational science has no friends because it's an uncomfortable situation. It's an unknown place, and so on and so forth. The transformational science become as such when you are first and foremost, facing skepticism or even more criticisms. That's typical of transformational science. And then eventually, people will start to look into that science and you start to have validation, independent validation from other scientists. Now, that's the case of the zonulin story with now more than 1,000 papers there. I mean, this also in the context of the skepticism of a field that, was vilified by, let's say, use and abuse of a term of a leaky gut, the leaky gut syndrome. So there was a lot of skepticism there and so on and so forth. I'm an evidence-based fellow. I do the experiments, I do the science. The science suggests that way. I put that out there, and that's the end of it. And then, it's something that goes in automatic. It will be, eventually validated by the others. So what happened with the zonulin story? Not only these 1,000 papers, but in the meantime, is, the science that suggests that, increased permeability is one of the 5 pillars of disease of humankind. That's been validated by the Human Genome Project, by, the evidence that, every kind of condition has a genetic predisposition for leaky gut, that kind of stuff. So that blocks, built the concept of, the increased gut permeability over time. But the beginning was tough. It was tough, when I moved to the United States and I started to look into celiac disease, there was no celiac disease. My first paper that I published when I came here, the title was Where All the American Celiac Are. There were none. And I received a huge amount of criticism by, looking into the reason why. Because said, how There, you come over here and teach us the lesson that celiac disease exists here and so on and so forth. We look for it, it's not here. At that time, the prevalence of celiac disease was 1 in 10,000 in the United States compared to 1 in 300 in Europe. And again, at that time, there were only two things, the two pillars, genetic and environment. The other three we didn't know yet. And I reasoned, how is that possible? The grains here and the grains in Europe are the same. The genetic is the same because the genetic, background of people in the United States mostly, are from Europe. And yet the disease is not here. I said, this is the kind of win-win situation for scientists because of the two. Either it's overlooked or there must be a third element that prevents these two to interplay, and I will win a Nobel Prize because, I will discover something that prevents diseases. Unfortunately, I did not.
Well,
Because was the
from your
first.
lips to God's ears, right? Listen, we're pulling down to the end. Claudia, won't you close us off with our 1%?
Yeah. So part of our 90% Healthy podcast is to help people make 1% shifts in their life to go from wherever they are, whether it's at 50%, 60% healthy, to reach that 90% where they are healthy, but they still have that 10% room for adaptation to get off track for a little bit. And I've seen a lot in this industry where a lot of people are going the extreme. I'm cutting this out completely and I'm not doing it ever, or I'm only doing XYZ. So there are a lot of extremes or a lot of people who are so confused they don't even know where to start. So I would love to ask you if you could provide an example of a small 1% shift that doesn't feel so heavy, yet can be sustainable long term, that our listeners could kind of cling on to. Maybe I can try this and see a difference over time, but not like tomorrow.
Yeah. So first of all, don't take life and yourself too seriously.
Amen. Yes.
Keep laughing. Respect your body as you want to respect anybody else around you. Have fun. Do not live in a fast lane of life. Take time to socialize with the people that you care for, including cooking together. And drink a good glass of wine every day.
I love that. Thank you so much. Yeah, I love how you mentioned all of this. And a lot of it was part of community, which Don and I have talked about in the past. And I think it's a huge pillar that our society has been struggling to get back on track.
Yeah, indeed.
Thank you,
Indeed.
Dr. Fasano. Really
So for
appreciate
our
your
listeners,
time.
I want to reemphasize,
Thank you.
when you take a look at Dr. Fasano's book, for someone who's been looking at this for decades, it was very impactful for me. It gives you a whole new perspective and just changing the lens. So I really recommend it. If you're struggling with gut issues, if you're struggling with bloating, if you're struggling, before you go for the pharmaceutical solution, it's not a bad idea to go back and experiment. Let's go ahead and just pull the gluten out and see what happens. Now, I'll warn you, if you do have this gluten sensitivity, gluten allergy, wheat allergy, you take it out of your diet and you get polluted again, it's awful. Okay, and you'll know what's going on at that point. Dr. Fasano, do we still need a biopsy of the small intestine to confirm celiac?
And most of the time, some limited time, in kids, if you have this clear sign of symptoms and a certain level of these antibodies, you can spare that. And now, people that are looking to the adults
And I
eventually to sparing those.
think as we improve our technologies and the things that are out there, when we can get past that procedure, we're really going to move the needle on this at a much more rapid level. But that's tough. But at the same time, like I said, our family experience was, when we removed gluten from our lifestyle, life got better. And you become very vigilant as to where your food comes from, what it's been around. I mean, if there's just crumbs get into my wife's diet, it's bad. It's not a good situation. So, but we absolutely don't want to go on a immune system lowering drug just so we can eat gluten still. Get it out of your diet and don't be afraid to do that. Dr. Fasano, we are so happy. This has been a wonderful hour with you. Thank you for the work that you do, because it impacts not just a lot of people, but it impacts my family. And I really appreciate that.
Well, thank you so much, Don. I really appreciate it. Appreciate
you
to
so
be
much.
on your show.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Claudia.